The coastal town of Mizushima was a place forgotten by time, its narrow streets perpetually shrouded in a thick, rolling fog that clung to the cobblestones like a living thing. The air was heavy with the scent of salt and decay, and the distant cry of gulls echoed through the mist, lending an eerie soundtrack to the desolate landscape. It was here, in this forsaken corner of the world, that Takeshi wandered, his footsteps muffled by the damp ground. A talented artist with a restless soul, he had come to Mizushima in search of inspiration, but the town's oppressive atmosphere only deepened his frustration. His mind was a blank canvas, and the weight of his unfulfilled potential pressed down on him like the fog itself. Takeshi's wanderings led him to a part of town he had never seen before, a labyrinth of alleyways that seemed to twist and turn with a life of their own. It was in one such alley, dark and slick with moisture, that he stumbled upon a store. The building was decrepit, its wooden sign hanging askew and its windows clouded with grime. Yet through the murk he could make out faint traces of art supplies, easels, canvases, and jars of pigment stacked haphazardly inside. A flicker of curiosity stirred within him, and he pushed open the creaking door. The interior was dimly lit, the air thick with the scent of mildew and something else, something metallic, like old blood. Shelves lined the walls, cluttered with dusty art materials that looked as though they hadn't been touched in decades. At the far end of the room, behind a counter strewn with yellowed papers, stood a man. His face was gaunt, his eyes sunken and devoid of warmth, as if they had seen too much and cared for too little. When he spoke, his voice was a dry whisper, like the rustling of dead leaves. "You seek something special, don't you?" the man rasped, his gaze fixed on Takeshi with unnerving intensity. Takeshi hesitated, then nodded. "I'm an artist. I need something to inspire me, something to break through the block I've been facing." The man's lips curled into a smile that didn't reach his eyes. He reached beneath the counter and produced a small, ornate bottle filled with a viscous black liquid. "This," he whispered, "is no ordinary ink. It has the power to give life to your creations, but be warned, it demands a price." Takeshi's heart quickened. The idea was absurd, yet something about the man's tone, the way his fingers trembled as he held the bottle, made it feel real. He handed over a few crumpled bills, barely registering the transaction, and left the store with the ink clutched tightly in his hand. Back in his cramped studio, Takeshi wasted no time. He dipped his brush into the ink, marveling at its strange consistency. It seemed to pulse with a faint, unnatural warmth. He began to draw, his hand moving with a fluidity he hadn't felt in months. The figure that emerged on the page was exquisite, a woman with flowing hair and delicate features, her eyes closed as if in peaceful slumber. But as he added the final stroke, something impossible happened. The woman's eyes snapped open and she turned her head, gazing directly at him. Takeshi dropped the brush, his breath catching in his throat. The figure moved again, her lips parting as if to speak, though no sound came. He blinked, certain it was a trick of the light. But the movement persisted. His creation was alive, at least within the confines of the page. A thrill of excitement coursed through him, drowning out the whisper of unease that tugged at the edges of his mind. Over the next few days, Takeshi experimented further, creating birds that fluttered their wings, landscapes that shifted with the passage of unseen winds, and animals that prowled restlessly across the paper. But with each drawing, he noticed something unsettling. The creations seemed to have a will of their own. A dog he had drawn bared its teeth when he tried to erase. A tree's branches twisted away from his brush as if in defiance. Still, he pressed on, convinced that this was the breakthrough he had been searching for. One night, as the fog pressed thickly against his window, Takeshi awoke to a faint scratching sound. His heart pounded as he sat up, straining to locate the source. The noise was coming from his desk, where his latest drawing lay, a humanoid figure, tall and slender, with limbs that seemed just a little too long. In the dim light he saw it. The figure was crawling off the page, its ink-black form oozing onto the wooden surface. Its body was distorted, its joints bending at unnatural angles, and its eyes, hollow and hungry, fixed on him with malevolent intent. Terror seized Takeshi. He lunged for the drawing, intending to tear it to shreds, but the creature resisted, its inky tendrils lashing out and wrapping around his wrist. The touch was cold, like the grip of death itself. With a desperate cry, he grabbed a bottle of turpentine and doused the figure, watching as it writhed and shrieked, a soundless scream, before finally dissolving back into the page. Takeshi stumbled back, his hands shaking. The room was silent once more, but the horror of what he had witnessed lingered. He knew he should destroy the ink, cast it into the sea, and never look back. Yet, even as fear gnawed at him, a darker, more powerful emotion took hold: ambition. If he could harness this power, control it, he could create art that the world had never seen. He could be remembered forever, and so, with a trembling hand, he picked up the brush once more, dipping it into the cursed ink. The fog outside thickened, and somewhere in the distance the gulls fell silent. The fog in Mizushima grew heavier, as if the town itself were sinking into a dreamless abyss. Takeshi's studio, once a sanctuary of creativity, now felt like a prison. The bottle of ink sat on his desk, its black surface gleaming with an unnatural sheen, almost pulsing in the dim light. Despite the terror of the crawling figure he had encountered, Takeshi couldn't bring himself to destroy the ink. Its power was intoxicating, a siren's call that drowned out the warnings screaming in his mind. He told himself he could control it, that he could shape its creations into something beautiful rather than monstrous. But the ink had other plans. Takeshi's drawings began to change. At first, he tried to create simple, harmless images, a flower, a bird, a serene landscape, but no matter his intent, the ink twisted his work. Petals curled into jagged claws, birds grew extra eyes that blinked in unnatural rhythms, and landscapes warped into desolate wastelands filled with writhing shapes. Each stroke of his brush felt less like his own, as if the ink were guiding his hand, whispering ideas into his soul. He painted a portrait of a young girl, her face radiant with innocence, only to watch in horror as her features melted into a grotesque mask, her mouth stretching into a silent scream filled with needle-like teeth. One morning, as the fog pressed against his windows, Takeshi heard a scream from the street below. He rushed to look, his heart pounding. In the alley outside his building, a neighbor, a quiet fisherman named Hiroshi, lay sprawled on the cobblestones, his body twisted at impossible angles. Hovering over him was a creature born from Takeshi's nightmares, a towering, ink-black monstrosity with limbs like knotted ropes and a face that was little more than a void. It turned its hollow gaze toward Takeshi, and for a moment he felt its hunger, a primal, insatiable need that chilled his blood. Then, with a sickening lurch, it melted back into the shadows, leaving Hiroshi's broken body behind. Panic spread through Mizushima like wildfire. More creatures appeared, slithering from alleyways and crawling up walls. A woman claimed to have seen a dog with too many legs devouring her cat. A child spoke of hands reaching from the fog to pull his friend into the dark. The townspeople whispered of curses and vengeful spirits, but Takeshi knew the truth. His creations were escaping the pages, no longer confined to the paper. The ink was breaking the boundaries between art and reality, and he was its unwitting conduit. Desperate to stop the chaos, Takeshi tried to destroy the ink. He poured it into a metal tin and set it ablaze, watching as the flames roared. but the fire only seemed to enrage the ink. It bubbled and hissed, reforming into its bottle as if untouched. He tried again, hurling the bottle into the sea, but the next morning it was back on his desk, its surface slick with salt water and something darker, something alive. Each attempt to rid himself of the ink left him weaker, his hands trembling, his vision blurring at the edges. He hadn't slept in days, haunted by the sound of scratching from his sketchbook, as if the drawings were clawing their way out, even when he wasn't working. Worse still, the ink began to act without him. One night, Takeshi awoke to find his hand moving across a canvas, painting a scene he hadn't conceived, a city in ruins, its streets filled with writhing, ink-born horrors. His fingers moved against his will, each stroke draining his strength. He tried to pull away, but the ink held him, its influence seeping into his mind like poison. Visions of the creatures filled his thoughts, grotesque amalgamations of flesh and shadow, their forms defying logic. He saw himself among them, his body twisted into something no longer human, his eyes as hollow as theirs. Takeshi sought help, running to the town's small police station to confess. "It's my fault," he stammered, showing them his sketchbook. Its pages filled with writhing monstrosities, but the officers only stared, their faces a mix of pity and disbelief. "You're overtired, Takeshi," one said, handing him back the book. "Go home and rest." That night, another creature attacked, tearing through a market and leaving a trail of blood. The town descended into chaos, its streets emptying as people locked themselves indoors, praying the fog would hide them from the horrors. In a final act of desperation, Takeshi returned to his studio and confronted the ink. "What are you?" he whispered, staring into the bottle. For the first time he thought he saw something move within it, a shadow, vast and formless, like the depths of a starless void. The realization hit him. The ink wasn't just a tool, it was alive, a malevolent force with a will far beyond his own. And it was using him to birth its creations into the world. As the chapter closed, Mizushima was a town under siege. The fog grew so thick it seemed to choke the air, and the creatures multiplied, their forms growing bolder, more vicious. Takeshi sat at his desk, the ink bottle before him, his hands stained black. He knew he had to fight it, but the ink's pull was stronger than ever, and deep within his mind a voice, not his own, whispered, "Keep drawing." Mizushima was no longer a town, but a wound in reality. Its streets choked with fog so dense it seemed to pulse with a heartbeat. The creatures born of Takeshi's ink roamed freely now, their forms defying comprehension, limbs that bent into spirals, faces that flickered between human and void, and shadows that whispered in languages no one could understand. Takeshi's studio had become a battlefield, his mind a fractured landscape where the ink's influence grew stronger with each passing hour. He hadn't slept in days, his body gaunt and his eyes bloodshot, but sleep was impossible when the scratching of his creations echoed in every corner. Determined to end the nightmare, Takeshi resolved to find the mysterious vendor who had sold him the ink. He stumbled through Mizushima's fog-laden alleys, the air thick with the stench of decay, and something older, something cosmic. The store was where he remembered it, but it seemed different now. Its walls sagged as if melting, and the windows glowed with a sickly light. Inside, the vendor waited, his gaunt face unchanged, his eyes like twin voids. "You've come to understand, haven't you?" he rasped, his voice cutting through the silence like a blade. "What is it?" Takeshi demanded, clutching the ink bottle so tightly his knuckles whitened. "What have you done to me?" The vendor's smile was a grotesque thing too wide for his face. He explained in a whisper that chilled Takeshi's soul. The ink was no mere substance, but an entity, a fragment of a vast, ancient being from beyond the stars. It had been trapped in liquid form eons ago, its essence bound by forgotten rituals, and it sought artists, creators whose imaginations could serve as gateways to the physical world. It chose you, the vendor said, because your hunger for creation is boundless, but it will consume you as it has all the others. Takeshi's mind reeled. He saw flashes of other artists, nameless, faceless figures from across centuries, their hands stained black, their bodies twisted into the very horrors they had drawn. The ink was a parasite, feeding on their creativity, their sanity, their lives, to birth itself into reality. And now, Mizushima was its canvas, its creatures the harbingers of a larger invasion. Takeshi realized he was not the first, nor would he be the last unless he stopped it. He returned to his studio, the ink bottle burning in his hand. The creatures were everywhere now, their forms seeping through the walls, their eyes watching him from every shadow. He tried to resist drawing, but the ink compelled him, his hand moving as if possessed. Each stroke brought new horrors into being, each one more grotesque than the last. Desperate, Takeshi scoured his studio for answers, finding an old sketchbook among his supplies, one that wasn't his. Its pages were filled with drawings eerily similar to his own, but older, the paper brittle and yellowed. The final page held a warning in trembling script. Trap it within yourself, or it will never stop. The realization hit like a thunderbolt. The ink could not be destroyed by fire or sea. It was too ancient, too vast, but it could be contained, bound within a vessel of its own making. Takeshi knew what he had to do, though the thought filled him with dread. He sat at his desk, the fog outside swirling as if in anticipation, and began to draw. This time, he drew himself, not as he was, but as he feared he would become. A creature of ink, his body a tangle of limbs and shadows, his face a hollow mask. As he worked, the ink fought back, its influence surging through his veins. His vision blurred, his heart pounded, and the studio seemed to warp around him, the walls bending inward as if reality itself were collapsing. The creatures gathered, their forms pressing against the windows, their whispers filling his mind. But Takeshi pressed on, pouring every ounce of his will into the drawing. With the final stroke, he felt a searing pain, as if his soul were being torn apart. The ink surged into him, merging with his blood, his thoughts, his very being. In that moment, Takeshi became the canvas. The creatures vanished, the fog lifted, and Mizushima fell silent. The ink was trapped within him, its power contained, for now. But Takeshi was no longer himself. His body moved, but his eyes were empty, his hands stained black. He wandered from the studio, leaving behind his sketchbook, its pages now blank, except for a single unfinished drawing of his own face, its expression frozen in agony. Days later, a young artist named Aiko arrived in Mizushima, drawn by rumors of a vanished painter whose work was said to be otherworldly. She found Takeshi's studio abandoned, his supplies scattered, his sketchbook open on the desk. The ink bottle sat beside it, its surface gleaming invitingly. Aiko picked it up, her fingers tingling at its warmth. She smiled, unaware of the shadow that stirred within. The cycle had begun anew.